It has been a hot minute since I've done a wrap-up of science fiction fantasy. With all my year-end content, this all had to get pushed into January, so yes, I'm back to talk about all of the recent releases, those that were published at the end of 2024, as well as a couple of new releases for 2025. I have some great books to talk about, some new favorites, including the one science fiction book that should have been in my top 10 books published in 2024, but of course I didn't read it till now, so now I just need to feel bad about the fact that I didn't read it in time to put it into that video. Tell me it's not an issue because I'm so frustrated about that. All that being said, let's get started. First, let's talk about that 2024 science fiction release that I wish I'd gotten to before the end of the year, and that is The Final Orchard by C.J. Rivera. Now, to be fair, this is an Angry Robot book that was sent through the mail, and the Canadian mail system was on strike for the end of the year, and so this didn't show up until just around the Christmas holidays, well after I had filmed and published my video, and so there was nothing I could do about it. But this is a story that's set in a future where those that are wealthy seek out to get bionic enhancements that allow them to have various abilities that enhance and also elongate their lives. And so it's set in this future where we follow this individual. Something horrific happens at the beginning of the story. The back of the book actually tells you what that is, but I went in pretty blind. I encourage you to do the same. And of course, it becomes a story that spirals from there. This is one I love, that it was just a solid piece of new science fiction. So we have this action thrillery plot. We have a good page turner where there is things happening that are progressing the story forward, but then we also get what I love in science fiction, something I look for and often see missing in the new releases, is some really interesting context of the story. So having this future surrounding these bionic enhancements and really what that does to society, getting to see how certain people based off of their privilege, their class, and their wealth are able to access things, and those that are simply trying to do their best, that are working hard, it is not enough. This one I felt like was full of great characters. You really understand their emotions, their reasoning behind their decisions in a way that made the story so much more personal. And I just had a really good time with this one. It wasn't a 5-star read, I don't want to oversell it, but it was a solid 4-star read that would have ended up somewhere in my rankings had I read it in time to put into this video. Instead, I had to cheat and put in a historical fiction by one of my favorite science fiction authors, you know what I'm talking about, in that video as a placeholder. But if I was looking for one more book to add to the list, definitely this one should have been in there, but I'm reviewing it now. Hopefully you don't all mind. Next up, we have Our Vicious Worlds by Bethany Jacobs. This is the sequel to the story that I read, I believe, last year, The Burning Stars. And this is a space opera / adventure thrillery story that follows, at the beginning of the story, 3 different perspectives. Their stories get intertwined and they go from there. I really can't talk about the details of the second book without giving away too much. And I'll just say that if you're looking for a good, solid science fiction story, this one definitely fits the bill. I don't think it would have made my favorites even if I'd read it last year, just because I don't find it particularly interesting in the way that I don't see it doing anything that I haven't seen done before, but I do think it's doing those things decently well. I think, again, if you're just looking for a newer science fiction series to get into, you're looking for something that is well written with good characters. It ticks a lot of those boxes. Just for whatever reason, there was nothing about this story that really got me personally excited enough to be a favorite. If anything, this probably would have ended up in my gift guide because I would have liked to have a few more science fiction picks for that list. So if you're for some reason needing a gift this time of year, it is a really good series, but again, you'll want to pick up book 1 to go along with this. Next up, we have Revenant X by David Wellington. This is the second book in a sci-fi horror series that started out with Paradise 1. The basic premise is that something has happened on this colony, and in the first book, individuals are sent off to investigate what is there, and of course it turns into a sci-fi horror narrative. Now, this is a series where I had a rather negative experience with the first book. I didn't entirely dislike the experience of reading it. It felt overly long, and I felt like it was very rushed and fast-paced without giving enough time for, again, the world building or really getting attached to the characters. So it wasn't already on the track to be a favorite, but I didn't really have a huge problem with it until the ending, which ends on the most giant cliffhanger of cliffhangers. And I recognize that the first book was written with the intention of writing more, but given the fact that I had to wait, I believe, about a year, and everyone else did, for another book, it felt incredibly dissatisfying to read it because it felt like someone had ripped out the final pages, and without knowing that it was going to be a giant cliffhanger, it felt like a very unwelcome and unwanted surprise. And so I almost didn't even want to continue on with this series, but when I was offered a review copy. I was still tempted to read it. I do love science fiction. I love horror. I love sci-fi and horror put together. It is kind of part of my brand. And so I did want to go into this one and try to give it a fair review. And I was pleasantly surprised that I wasn't as angry about this book as I thought I was going to be. I think for me, a lot of my anger about the first book, again, really had to do with the fact that it left the book so unsettled, but enough time has passed that the actual emotions around that reading experience have simmered. And so this one picks up and you get to find out basically where the last one left off. And once that was satisfied, I didn't mind this one. I don't think, again, it's the best character work. I don't think it's the most innovative plot. It's definitely leaning into some of the tropes of the horror thriller genre when it comes to science fiction that is hoping to entice in readers. But I don't think it's doing anything incredibly special. I also don't think this one did anything horrific. I wasn't as mad about the ending or anything like this. If you're wondering, there is one more book, so this is not the final part to the series, but I did feel like at least this book was a little bit more mindful of how it ended things. And so if anything, I just had a really indifferent, fine experience with this book, which arguably is not the endorsement you're probably looking for to run out and rush to read the series. I will say that I now feel a little bit better recommending it because, again, if you're interested in Paradise 1, at least you know you can immediately pick up book 2, which again was my biggest problem, is that if you're going to do a cliffhanger like that, you almost have to hold the publication and publish the books pretty much back to back, maybe a month apart or even a week apart, or put them out together and just say it was too big for one volume. But having to wait so long, again, I just think is really an unfair thing to do to readers, given the fact that it was such an unsatisfying ending to book 1. But this one was fine, which is kind of a boring thing, but the honest truth. Now let's switch over to fantasy. I do want to quickly mention the Lotus Empire by Tasha Suri. This is the third and final book to an Indian-inspired epic fantasy series. I talked about this in my end of the year favorites. I was able to sneak it in while filming that video, and so I do really enjoy this one. Again, you want to start back at the beginning, but if you're looking for a fantasy series from a non-European perspective, something a little bit different, something very feminist, character driven, a little bit slower burning, this one definitely has a lot of those elements that I like and thought it came together very well with an overly solid ending, which I think is really hard to do. I'm often very critical of endings and I thought this one was good, so recommend this series if you haven't read it yet. If you have, I do recommend continuing it on and finishing out this trilogy. Next we have Blacklight Born by Alexander Darwin, the third and final book in the trilogy that starts with combat codes. And this is one where we follow an individual character in the first book who has these martial abilities and he is fighting. It's one where I enjoyed the combat. I found that I do really enjoy stories that focus on individual combat where someone has to work hard and train and they're not necessarily just incredibly talented but also have to work for it. It's something I really liked in, say, the Greenbone saga. And so I liked a lot of what this series was doing. I will say as an ending book, this one was fine. It has been a while since I read the first 2 books, and unfortunately, I was a little bit disappointed that I didn't find myself very attached to the characters. This series, in my mind, just doesn't have quite the most memorable characters, especially if something, again, is going to be that close person perspective about their martial history. I felt like you need really unique individuals, and these characters and our protagonist, I just didn't feel were as compelling as I wanted them to be. Again, it was a fine ending to a fine series, but not a personal favorite of mine. And moving on to a 2025 release that I just got to read, that is Breath of the Dragon by Shannon and Fonda, yes, of the Greenbone saga fame. And so this is the first book in a duology. This is technically a piece of young adult fiction, but given the author, I was interested in diving into it. This one follows a teenager who wants to go into this tournament to prove his prowess. This is set in the world where certain people have these special abilities that are known to be gifts from the dragons, and we see them all trying to fight and progress. Now, it's clear from the beginning of the story, and this is part of the 4, that it does mention the fact that this whole series is meant to be a love letter to martial arts, and it is clear as you go into it. You're going to see a lot of nods and references and things that just feel very familiar if you know some of the tropes of martial arts movies and so forth. We have seen Fonda incorporate these martial arts abilities into her previous books, and so no surprise they're here again. I really enjoyed those parts. As someone who had seen some martial art movies, my husband enjoys them a little bit more than me, or has seen more at least, but the parts I recognize, I adore those connections. because I love seeing someone, again, working hard and fighting. And compared to the series that starts with Combat Code, reading Fonda Lee again just really reminded me how good she is of not just writing good combat, but good characters that, again, you see progressing and you care about them, you want them to succeed. I will mention that compared to the Greenbone Saga, I didn't find these characters as complex, as interesting, but again, I think it's hard to compare it to one of my personal all-time favorites, that anything else kind of is a bit shallow in comparison, or just hard to hit those same highs. As I mentioned, this is also a young adult series, so if you're someone like myself that typically reads adult fiction, know that this is one that you may want to dip into. I was pleasantly surprised and happy to see that it didn't have some of the tropes that I tend to want to avoid. Instead, the characters are younger and there is none of the adult subject matter that you see in the Greenbone Saga that would make it inappropriate for teenagers, but at the same time, the teenagers feel like well fleshed out characters. They happen to be younger. This book is safe to put in a teenager's hand, but it doesn't feel like it's written down to them or leaning into, again, some of the tropes that make the rest of us roll our eyes. So do recommend it if you're a fan of Fonda Lee. I do think this one's good to pick up. I don't think it's as good as a Greenbone Saga, but I think that's a really high mark to reach, and I think even a step down from that quality is still better than most of the fiction that's getting published today, so I'd still recommend it if you're a fan of her work. And finally, I read Wind and Truth by Brandon Sanderson. This is, of course, the 5th book in the Stormlight Archive series. I thought about doing an individual review for this book, but given my reaction to it, I decided it was better to include it in this wrap-up here because I suspect that the people going to seek out long-form reviews are probably the ones that want to gush about it. And I will be fully honest that this book has dampened, once again, my excitement for this series. Now, for context, a while back, I had read the first book in this series and I liked it, but didn't love it enough to continue on. Since then, I did get a chance to read and catch up on the series and got more excited about it. I do think the series has some highs. As a 5th book, I found this one to be a letdown, but again, keep in mind that it's someone who is not coming in as a big fangirl of the series. I like it, I appreciate it. I think it's great for those that are still getting into epic fantasy and don't mind that the characters, in my mind, some of the plotting, world building, are good but not the most complex. And that's what I really saw with this one, is that I felt like the characters constantly had to tell other characters what they were feeling, what their motivations were, why they were doing everything, and just everything was spelled out so clearly on the page. It just felt like it was overly simplified for how big and vast the series is supposed to be. It's still written in a way that I feel like the author is overly holding her hands, or perhaps doesn't know a more complex way to communicate some of the ideas. And I can see he's trying. There's definitely conversations around mental health and well-being, but everything has to be the character telling us how they're feeling and spelling that out in a way that I would much rather see versus being told. Also with that, of course, this book is incredibly long. If I love a book, I have no problem with that. I've read books over 1,000 pages. I'll be talking about that more soon. But if I'm honest, when it comes to books like this, a book that is just fine with characters that I haven't completely fallen in love with and a world that I find overly simplified, despite the massive stakes surrounding the story, despite the big military battles and back and forth, doesn't go to the highs of making me want to spend this much time with it. Honestly, I'm just finished reading it as I came to record this video, and if you can't tell from how I'm talking about this, I just feel really fatigued. I was really ready to be done. I do consider myself a fast reader, but this book was longer than I would have liked. I would say if you're a fan of the series already, it wasn't that much different than the previous books, but I think I'm kind of realizing that it's not going to get to the level of excellence of what I seek in my fiction when I am looking for a fantasy book. I've had people comment in other videos saying that I'm not a true fantasy reader if I don't absolutely love this series. I appreciate it. There's things I like about it. I am more interested, I think, in rereading the first couple books, which were my favorites, rather than continuing on from here. I just don't feel like it's really going in the direction that I would love to see it go. It feels like it needs more editing, more polishing, and I would love to see this story handled by someone who has writing that is more to my taste and has some of the skills of weaving stories in very subtle ways that I would rather have done. Say someone like Ken Liu would just be more to the kind of story that I would really get excited about and be happy to spend thousands of pages with, which is just, if I'm honest, was not the case here. So that's it for this video here. I'd love to know the books I talked about. Which ones are you planning on checking out for yourself? And I recognize I have some unpopular opinions, particularly when it comes to the Stormlight Archives. So just know I suspect a lot of you watching this are big fans of that series, and I'm really glad it's working better for you than it is for me. I do recognize I have some really picky tastes when it comes to certain writing styles and positioning and narrative voice, and so I am glad it works for you. I never want to yuck your yum, and really respect if we can agree to disagree and talk about it more in the comments. So if you're new to my channel, do you want to stick around and subscribe? Appreciate that. You can drop a comment, even just an emoji. You can also give me a thumbs up if you think I deserve it, and hit that little notification bell so you don't miss a video from me. Thanks so much for watching. Talk to you again soon. Okay, bye-bye.